We hear, my dear brothers and sisters, on the Solemnity of St. Joseph, examples of God's faithfulness and the faith that he calls us to have in his ability to work the impossible. In the first reading, we heard specifically God's promise to David that he would establish his throne forever and that his descendants would always sit on the throne. And yet, there's a certain point in the Old Testament where one of his descendants, who is king, God gets so mad at that guy, he says, never will one of his descendants be king. Well, here's the problem. That seems like two contradictory words now, doesn't it? God promising that the lineage of David, that throne would be established forever, and then God getting mad at one of the sons of David, through whom this promise is supposed to be fulfilled, and saying, oh, one of your descendants won't be king. Joseph, the son of David, is actually descended from that king. And we see how God is able to work the impossible through Joseph. Because God knew from the beginning of time that this son of David, Joseph, would be the one who would be married to Mary when God would intervene in Mary's life and ask her to become the mother of God incarnate, the mother of the Messiah. And she would ask a very simple question, because she is a Jewish woman who is in the first part of her wedding, but her groom has not taken her into his home for the wedding feast, so they're contractually married. So they haven't consummated the marriage yet. So you folks who are married, imagine being married for a year and a half or a year or so and not yet consummating the wedding. Seems contradictory to us, but this was how it was back in the day. So when Mary all of a sudden is pregnant, and Joseph doesn't know where this is from, in human reasoning, he can only think one way, that Mary has betrayed him, right? And according to the Jewish law, Joseph can divorce Mary for whatever reason whatsoever, and just dismiss her quietly that way. Or he can accuse her of adultery and have a public trial, and they can see that she's pregnant, and he can say, I haven't been with her yet. And then they would go and stone her. So being a just man, right, he comes up with the most compassionate of solutions. He wants to follow the law, and he realizes, okay, I love Mary, I don't want to see her killed, so I'm just going to dismiss her for whatever reason, which he could do, according to the law. It was just. This was what could happen. And God interrupts. God asks Joseph, son of David, to be willing to set aside what he thinks is right and just. That's not an easy task. It's not easy to be called from what one can see, like the legalism of the law, to be called from that to a relationship of complete and total trust in God, where Joseph has to say, you're telling me that she conceived by the Holy Spirit. We must know something. The gospel doesn't tell us this per se, but the fact that Joseph immediately obeys says that Joseph must have been, it's a reasonable thing to assume, he must have had such a prayer life that he was able to discern immediately between what was from God and what wasn't from God. Or it might have been that God just gave him the grace to know that. They call that consolation without prior cause. And people who've had those kinds of moments where God just interrupts, not even when they're necessarily even praying sometimes, And they just know it's God. There's just no other explanation. And they're at peace. They're not sitting there, well, was it God? Was it not God? The immediate result is that it's God. And that's what we hear in that second reading, too, about faith, the faith of Abraham. Abraham, who had to be called twice to leave behind what he knew. First, he leaves Ur of the Chaldees, right? And he is called, and he goes to Haran. Actually, God had called him to Canaan, but he stopped in Haran. And then God again has to call him. Abraham, come on, come further. And he becomes a sojourner, a pilgrim, or as the Hebrews would say, a wandering Aramaean. And God makes all sorts of promises to Abraham, and he doesn't yet have a child. Your descendants are going to be like the stars in the sky. And Abraham says, well, if you said so, then I believe it. One might say, hey, Abraham, how'd you get your name, Father of the Nations? Like, you don't even have a child. How are you Father of the Nations? People might taunt him. Yet he had to keep believing. And even when he and Sarah tried to figure out the promise on their own and go after the promise by saying, well, maybe it's through Hagar, so try that. The answer was no. God still blessed Ishmael, the son. But God said, no, I meant you and Sarah. You and Sarah are going to have a child. That which seemed impossible because of the fact that she was advanced in age and he was advanced in age became possible because of the God of the impossible. This is the faith that we see too in Joseph the Just. Calling one out from one's own security. Calling one out from his normal life, where it's only what is written in the law. Getting Joseph to become also one who would be willing to sojourn. That is, willing to start this adventure with Mary. To create a community in which Jesus, the Son of God, the Messiah, could be born and raised and taught the law, the prophets, be given food, shelter, clothing. But Joseph also had to be a trusting man, because then God taps him again in a dream and tells him, hey, get up, go. Get up and go. Just pick up everything and go, because Herod is trying to kill the child. And so he goes to Egypt. He becomes a refugee. Crossing borders with small children. Why didn't he think about the child? Why did he cross a border? Didn't he know that the Egyptian border security were going to get him? Oh wait, they didn't have those kinds of strict laws back then, I guess. He was able to take refuge with the Jewish community there in Egypt and there make a living. And then, of course, God taps him again and says, okay, you can go back now. Your time in Egypt is done. Living by faith, living in that relationship of trust with God, is not easy if we're just used to being in control. It's kind of like being on a roller coaster without a seatbelt. God, you got me. Hang on for the ride. But Jesus also said that that's how it is with those who are born from above, that is, born in the kingdom. That the wind blows From where and where it goes, who knows? But that's how it is with those who are born in the Spirit. That suddenly we're not the ones figuring everything out. We are not the ones who even know what tomorrow is going to bring. Isn't it St. James who said that we shouldn't say this is what's going to happen, that what we should say is God willing, because we don't know. Because then it puts everything in that trusting relationship with God. I find it very, very wonderful that St. Joseph is the second greatest saint that we celebrate. The first, of course, is Mary. The second is St. Joseph, in terms of holiness of life. And he was a carpenter, a husband, and a foster father. It's beautiful. It goes to show that it isn't the state of life that matters so much as it is our willingness to have that kind of open faith life with God, where we are putting everything into His hands every day, instead of saying, okay, this is what I'm doing, now God, you bless it. Instead we could say, God, why don't you tell me what it is that you want me to do today? And so that's what we ask the Lord today, is that He give us that kind of faith, the faith of St. Joseph, the faith of Abraham, because this is what we're supposed to be living. That's what it said. We hear that specifically all of those who are brought in are supposed to be living according to that promise of Abraham. That is, that we are supposed to be living that same kind of promise of inheriting the nations as the church, but also as men and women who are walking in that same kind of faith. That God said it, I'm going to believe it, even if it seems contradictory, even if it seems impossible. Like, how can God promise that David's son's always going to reign, and then all of a sudden he says a word to one of his descendants that seems to put an end to that, and God is still faithful to His word and brings it about by having Joseph adopt Jesus. God always has a way. And so we give thanks to God for His ways, because they are higher than ours. And we ask Him for the humility to surrender to His ways that are higher than ours.